Hello and welcome to this introductory training on our opening day of our Blended Learning Conference. This training will be about moving from blended to personalized learning, and it's intended for teachers who have already begun using blended learning in their classroom and are ready to take the next steps. For you, if that's describing you well, you already understand what blended learning is, which is a mix of online and face-to-face learning, and why we do it. Part of why we engage in blended learning is to increase cognitive engagement in our classes, to increase student ownership and responsibility for their learning, and to help build 21st century skills, allow for anytime, anywhere access to our content. This has, of course, been vital as we've begun in remote learning this last semester. But it's also important for students to enhance the already wonderful things that all teachers do in the classroom. Sometimes when folks look at new forms of teaching like blended learning, they sometimes see this as an either or, as in either you're old school or you're new school. And when I'm talking about old school, there's some wonderful things that we can't just be an either or and feel like we can throw out. Some of those things include teaching strategies that are highly effective, research-based, and that we know have had the test of time that work. Right? So it's not really an old school or new school kind of thing where maybe the new school of technology just takes over the old school. That's not what we're talking about. Instead, what we'd like to promote is this idea that's presented in the book Bold School, which is new school blended learning technology in combination with old school wisdom, or the wisdom that comes from tried and tested and researched teaching strategies. These two things combined help to enhance the learning in the classroom. And so, if we begin to think about how we might do that, it's important to start with first things first. And instead of technology first, we really need to focus on the learning first. And so the intended learning outcomes are what we want to identify first when we do blended learning. Identify the outcomes, the standards, the skills that we want our students to gain. And then select from there highly effective teaching strategies, some of those strategies from Hattie like questioning or metacognition or teacher clarity. And then after that, select tools that will help us enhance those strategies. Okay? Instead of the other way around saying, what am I going to use Flipgrid to teach today? We instead need to focus on the outcomes we want, the strategies we know will be effective, and then the tools that can enhance those strategies. So you probably already know a lot of that if you've been doing some blended learning in your classroom before, but I wanted to reiterate it. And I wanted to say that not all outcomes for blended learning really are enabled when we simply augment or enhance our instruction with a tool, right? Some of what we need to shift are, in fact, methods for allowing more personalized instruction. And that's where we're going to head today. We'll look at some of the whys behind blended learning. These are accomplished less as we start to integrate technology and more as we start to purposely think about how we can personalize for students. So in anytime, anywhere learning that we've been using through remote learning and blended learning this past year, that's a great piece that allows students to differentiate based on their place that they're at. When we look at customized learning, that's talking about students differentiating their path, meaning based on different learning modalities, based on their interests, they have choice into which way is going to work best for them to customize and maximize their learning. So navigating this differentiation based on path, as well as in competency-based learning, we're talking about differentiating based on their pace. So as they're able to demonstrate mastery, they're able to move through at a more rapid pace. These are the elements of blended learning that are accomplished when we begin to personalize learning. And that seems really daunting. I will be the first to admit that that seems like a mind-blowing and totally, profession-altering kind of realization. But what we need to do is look at, are there structures in place that allow us to do this? And to get there, I'm going to talk a little bit about a story that comes from Todd, and the full story in his TED Talk will be listed below. But this story begins back in 1952, the Air Force having, great pilots and even better planes than they had ever had before, but yet they were having worse results. So the Air Force had a problem. And they first pinpointed the pilots as the problem. Then they, blamed the flight instructors. Sounds like a common theme. But then they ultimately pinpoint the issues were in the cockpit. And by the issues in the cockpit, I mean that basically, when you're in these life or death situations, the fit between you and your cockpit and the instruments in your cockpit are of vital importance, right? If something's just out of reach, then it'll be misplaced in the nick of time. So this causes a problem for the Air Force because, of course, not all pilots are the same size. And so what do they do? Well, it seems intuitive that they would design the cockpit based on the average pilot, right? That it would fit the most based on the average pilot. Well, of course, that seems intuitively right, but unfortunately, it was determined that that was exactly wrong. And that was done by a researcher named Gilbert, who studied 4,000 Air Force pilots. And what he did was he studied them based on 10 dimensions of size. And he wanted to know, he asked a simple question, how many of these pilots are average? How many of these pilots are average on all 10 dimensions of size? And well, what he found was that exactly 0 of them were average. So when the cockpit is designed based on average, it's actually designed for no one. And so the Air Force took this realization as they studied more and found that we all have a jagged size profile, which makes sense because if you're the tallest, you're not always the broadest or the heaviest, right? So you've got all of these things to consider when you're designing for pilots, and many of us are not average in all dimensions. We have a jagged size profile like this. And so what the Air Force decided to do was to, in fact, ban the average, saying to manufacturers they would no longer accept planes with a cockpit design based on average, and that they asked them to design to the edges to fit the maximum number of pilots. Well, manufacturers kind of pushed back and said that's impossible, but as the Air Force stood their ground, it became possible, and it wasn't as expensive as was initially thought, with innovations like things like adjustable seats that we see in our cars every day. So, with that, more Air Force pilots were better fit to their cockpits, and allowed for those who would have traditionally never fit in a cockpit designed on average to access and become some of our best fighter pilots. And although we've probably never all sat in a $150 million fighter jet, we have all had the experience of being both a student and a teacher in a classroom that has traditionally been designed on average. And again, that sounds like the best method for delivery, but in reality, there's no such thing as an average student. Much like we all have a jagged size profile, when we look at the learner profiles for students, and we measure students based on 10 dimensions of their learner profile, from memory to their reading ability to their interests and cognitive abilities, we find that no student is average in all dimensions. They're not all high in all dimensions or all low in all dimensions. They're simply a mix. And so with that being said, we have to consider designing to the edges. And that's what I'd like you to think about as you begin to start exploring tools these next couple of days and getting involved in how you can more personalize your instruction. Because, you know, designing based on average is really all we could do when the tools at our disposal were, just static books. But when we have more at our disposal now, we can realize a greater potential. There is a lot we can do. There's a structure in place that helps us to actually have this kind of personalized learning. And it comes from Ed Elements and their core four of personalized learning. The core four are these: data-driven decisions. Teachers pull data to understand where students are at and group students based on that data. They target instruction based upon that data and provide one-on-one or small group instruction to meet their needs. They offer flexible content delivery in a multiple different ways so that students, as they enter the science class, first and foremost don't have a reading test every time, right? If I struggle in reading, maybe some of the science material ought to be presented in video, graphics, slides, other things other than just reading from my textbook or reading articles, right? So you can see how that kind of flexible content delivery could be beneficial, as well as tools that are adaptive and flexible based on the needs of the student. And then finally, offering student choice, offering them a choice in the way that they take their path in education, as well as how they present their products to demonstrate mastery, and reflect and own their own learning. One of the biggest pieces that is indicative of student success as they leave our K-12 system and they enter into post-secondary education is not necessarily their understanding of academics and how rigorous their academics previously were. It's more about how they handle the freedom that comes with post-secondary education, and if they've learned to be self-directed and own their own learning. So what I'd like you to do now is, as you progress over today and you begin to look at tools, keep this model in your mind. How am I going to pull data from my students to understand their learning on a frequent basis through formative assessment tools? How am I going to employ flexible content, right, to differentiate for my students' learning interests and needs? How am I going to provide a model that allows for student choice, allows for their reflection and goal setting, in addition to freeing me up for small group or one-on-one instruction to meet their needs? Consider all that as you explore and you begin to work in tools to enhance your blended learning experience and move towards personalized learning experience. Tomorrow when we meet, we're going to look more at the continuum of each of these core four areas and see where we're at, reflect on that, and set goals for where we need to go next. There's a series of tactics and resources for you as you plan blended learning, because it may seem like this is too grandiose, too chaotic, and we need to help you provide some structure and some next steps so this can become concrete. So I want you to keep this framework in mind today, not get too bogged down with it, but keep it in mind. Tomorrow we'll dig into what exactly this could mean and what next steps will look like. Well, I hope you have a great day, and call us over as you need help getting started with moving from blended learning to personalized learning. Thank you.